we are at the earliest possible stages with how we go about understanding how good these products are. There is no real playbook for us to work to. You're doing a huge amount of important work to try and understand what that playbook should consist of. But the fact of the matter is that right now, at this point in time, that playbook does not exist.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan from vals.ai, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Dan. Dan's the head of R&D at vLex. Before that, he was the head of data science at Mishcon de Reya, and he's also a former practicing English barrister. Thanks so much for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for flying over from London for it.
Yeah, this is all I'm out here doing, actually. This interview came 5,000 miles to do this.
Well, we're glad to host you in our office. Well, maybe just to kick it off, can you tell me a little bit about why you're interested in participating in this VLAIR study?
Well, I think the honest answer is we didn't really want to do the study. My initial reaction when the invitation came through was, I wouldn't call it horror, but it definitely wasn't something that I was kind of jumping at the chance to participate in. And I think the reason for that is that, and I can't speak for other vendors, but this is such a new space. Like, we're talking about really nascent capabilities, and opening our products up, I think, to this type of scrutiny does not feel comfortable to us. It's not something, frankly, that I imagine anyone would honestly say they want to do. So I think there were a couple of factors that drove us forward today to kind of actually joining you on this study. The first was that I had in the back of my mind, frankly, the damage that earlier attempts to do this had done to really like the community's understanding of how we talk about this subject and how we measure quality. The second, frankly, was that we were aware that other vendors were participating and we didn't want to be left out. So I think we were reluctant participants at that point, and now, coming through to the other side of it, I'm glad that we did.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a very honest take. But one of the motivations we had for this study was just seeing that law firms and the practitioners of the tools were so unsure how to actually go about studying or evaluating the products.
Yeah.
Do you have to overcome this when you chat with law firms as well, as to the number of products they're testing and how they're testing the tools?
Yeah, of course we do. But it's in that scenario, it's a lot more organic. It's one thing to be working with a customer, understanding what they're trying to achieve, and moving through that process together bit by bit. Because in that scenario, we as a vendor and the client have control kind of how all of that happens. With a study like the one we're talking about here, all of that control from our perspective melts away very quickly because, for example, we don't even know how the tasks are being run and what questions you're asking. So it's analogous, but it is different because in this situation, we're opening ourselves up quite blindly to a set of tests that we know very little about, and it's a leap of faith.
Right. To the greatest extent possible, if we can collect more data that's representative of how the lawyers actually want to use the tools, then hopefully it's less ambiguous what it actually is we're testing in reviews like this.
I would agree with that, and I think, I don't know whether you'd agree with me when I say that we are at the earliest possible stages with how we go about understanding how good these products are. There is no real playbook for us to work to. You're doing a huge amount of important work to try and understand what that playbook should consist of. But the fact of the matter is that right now, at this point in time, that playbook does not exist. There is no one that really understands how to do this perfectly, and we are all feeling our way through. And I think it's important. It's important for vendors like us and like the others to take part in these studies and really help you get the best out of them. But equally, I think it's really important for all of us to recognise that these are such early days, and there are lots of questions that we need to answer that we haven't got round to kind of fully addressing. So this is a learning journey for everyone.
Maybe let's try and make that a little bit more explicit. Like, what are some of these fundamental questions that are still unsolved and we need to get to the bottom of today?
Well, I think number one is task definition, actually. So I think a good example here that comes out of the study is actually redlining. It's an interesting one for me because as a former lawyer in England, obviously I'm familiar with the term redlining. But I also know that redlining means one thing for lawyer A and another thing entirely for lawyer B. And with these studies, I think it's important that there's a consensus on what is the actual task that we're evaluating here. Do we fully understand the contours of how this test is going to be performed? So I think task definition there's some distance left to run in getting good at that. I think the second is about lawyer baseline. I was really pleased to see that your study included a lawyer baseline. That's super useful. But that opens up another can of worms about, well, how do we begin to understand what that baseline really represents? How good, to put it kind of bluntly, were the lawyers that constitute the baseline? What's their experience level? What are their strengths? What practice area are they good? What practice areas are they strong in? And I think that's just scratching the surface, really.
Right. It's totally the start. It's also, pretty challenging ground to stand on because any lawyer looking at that would say, "Oh, but I'm a better lawyer than these lawyers that you've queried." So it is challenging to assess how the actual work product of these tools compare to the equivalent of any given lawyer.
Yeah.
But I think you also bring up a good point, which is that the legal services industry is by no means a monolith.
No, absolutely
there are
not.
so many different separate tasks and constituent parts, and it's going to take many iterations to really pin down what are the most valuable use cases for generative AI in practices across the board.
Yeah.
How do you think about that at vLex when you're looking to develop a product that can serve a wide distribution of customers?
I think the way we look at it is, at no point are we telling ourselves that we are trying to build an end-to-end solution for any given workflow. We're not trying to solve a specific problem in totality. We're not trying to do that because at this point in time, I think we're fairly honest with ourselves, and I think we're a low enough ego organisation to realise that we're not actually positioned to do that yet. So I think when we're trying to solve a new problem or we're looking at existing functionality, we're very much in this headspace of how do we provide our user, whether they are a lawyer of 2 years PQE or a senior partner that's been at the firm for 40 years, how do we give them the best and most reliable and trustworthy starting point for the task that they're trying to perform? And once you kind of make peace with the fact that you're not trying to build this solution that's, in effect, trying to kind of like emulate the lawyer all the way through, it's quite freeing because you're able to deliver value that I think is more reasonably framed and kind of respects the fact that we can't solve a problem that is going to satisfy every single lawyer out there in the same way. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of pointless to try doing that. We need to kind of reduce the ask on ourselves down to, can we provide our own baseline of functionality that hits the 80-20 rule? Can we satisfy 80% of our users to an acceptable level and leave it to the people that want to take things further to do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think there's been a long-standing debate as to are these tools that are augmenting existing humans, or are they, lawyer in a box replacing end-to-end the work that they're actually doing? And also, it's very challenging to trace the hockey puck of this because the foundation models and the base in which everyone's building is changing so rapidly.
Yes.
And so it's challenging to remain dynamic and really predict where all these tools are going, even in 2 to 10 years.
But I suppose, like, on the whole, augment, replace kind of dichotomy, which I think is, in a way, I can't believe we're still talking about that. We're talking about tools, and by definition, a tool is there to augment, not to replace. And at vLex, we are very firmly in the camp that we're building tools to help lawyers do their jobs. We're not interested and we're not able to build a system that can be a lawyer. And I don't really think at this point there are that many vendors that are taken seriously that are peddling that particular line. But to the extent that there are, I think they're barking up the wrong tree.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's go to completely different. Actually, let's unwind a little bit to a different topic. You talked about how we're still in the early days, in particular around developing a shared language of evaluation and the methodology for that. Let's talk about the opportunity. So, what would it look like if we were able to, as an industry, have a shared definition of what good looks like and what evaluation of the products looks like? Where's the opportunity there?
Well, I think the obvious opportunity that you get from having that core conceptual infrastructure in place is that you're able to take evaluation-driven development to the next level. We're able to, as we begin to think about bringing a new piece of functionality forward, we have a framework that we can begin to develop against, that we know the community buys into. So we're able to be far more open about the performance we're able to provide for any given thing that we try to build, in a form that the community is able to consume and make sense of. And I think it's just, common standards in any domain are useful because it means the lingua franca that we're using as developers and the market's using as consumers, they're compatible and we know what everyone's talking about.
Completely different topic here, but I saw you made a LinkedIn post. It seems like legal tech people are on LinkedIn for more hours a day than they're working.
I used to be on Twitter when it was Twitter.
Nevertheless, I saw some posts that you made about how you're making evaluation a big priority for vLex over this year. What do you want to see in 2025 for evaluation of vLex and then maybe for evaluation in the industry at large?
So there is a big push to beef up internal evaluation of vLex this year, and that's something that the R&D team have kind of taken ownership of and are working to kind of bring about. We have, at the moment, a good internal capability to evaluate what we're doing, but we need much more scale, not just in terms of the amount of eval coverage we have. In other words, how many evaluations do we have for a given piece of functionality, but we want to increase the complexity of our evaluations. We want to make them more challenging. And to do that, and I think this is the really big challenge for evaluation generally, is you need people with very specific skills that are expensive to come by. And I think that's the challenge for all of us in this space is how do we bring more lawyers into the development process? How do we make sure the people that we bring into that process represent the users that we're trying to build things for? And how do we make sure that the people that are writing our evaluations are good at that? Because we're placing a lot of trust in those people to get these things right, so that we know when we put something out into the wild, a user on here on the west coast of the US or someone in London or someone on the continent in Europe is being given an experience that they can actually use and gives them value.
I mean, that was one of the big issues we were trying to overcome with the study as well, which is just you want the data you're using for testing and evaluation to be representative of that wider distribution where the tools are actually going to be used. And then also needing to make sure that the lawyers involved in the study have a shared language as to how do you write these rubrics for what constitutes a good answer? How do you frame a question effectively so that it can be tested across all of these products in a uniform way?
But there's other things that, what you just said, it just opens up even more questions. Like how do we have a good taxonomy of eval question style? vals.ai did this great piece of work last year on the case law data set where you had this kind of blend of extractive and summative tasks. And one of the things when I read that at the time that I really liked was the fact that you'd taken the time to actually build some taxonomy around the types of evaluations that you were going to be running against that data set. But there isn't really any consensus around that. There's no structure. And I think the absence of structure at the moment is purely a symptom of the fact that this is also new.
Right.
It's also new. And so we're going to get better at this over time, but it's not going to be perfect now because it is also new.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'd like to see over the next year that shared language of taxonomy developed as well. Are there other ways that you'd like to see benchmarking evolve over the next year?
I think that common language, those standards are the thing I kind of want to see first. And I mean, I hope you don't mind me asking a question back to you, but
go for it. Yeah.
you know, in terms of kind of how you see that moving forward, those common standards, that common terminology, you know, how do we make that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there may be some ways that we can look to existing definitions of tasks.
Yeah.
We had earlier guests in conversation who talked about how lawyers bill their hours and classify their hours in particular categories. So that might be one dimension to look at. I actually think a genealogical approach is probably going to be the one that gets the closest right answer, and that just amounts to having a continual back and forth with more and more players in the field and defining what the tasks are and collecting samples that are representative of those.
Yeah. I think that's another challenge here, isn't it? Is that, you know, if you take the study, what you have in there are, you know, really the leading vendors in this space. And, you know, you opened up by asking me, you know, how I felt about participating in this study. And, you know, I think my answer was I felt reluctant. You know, it wasn't something I was loving the idea of. And I think actually being able to get the vendors to kind of come together as much as they feel able to provide a kind of a vendor-based consensus of how we think some of this works, I think that's really going to help, because ultimately you're evaluating the tools that we're building. And so this needs to be a kind of a two-way exchange in thinking. And I think it makes sense for the vendors to you know, try and get themselves on the same page. How are we going to make it easy for trusted partners in the space, people that we feel are able to do evaluation well, to evaluate the products that we're building?
Yeah, I mean, vendors certainly see a lot of the market as well. But I think it's also it's really important to take the practitioner and the buyer as a first order. Because even if they don't understand the technology very well, they clearly understand their job very well.
Yeah, of course.
And we wouldn't want to dismiss that. But I think then also that point comes to the need to engage a wider audience, right? Because for this study, we only sourced questions from big law firms, neglecting the entire general counsel population, who also stands to benefit significantly from these advances. And so it'll really be our burden to try and identify more trusted players in the field who can give us that information.
Yeah, and what you just said there, of course, you know, it was very big law focused. Obviously, it's very US centric.
Right.
It's completely US centric. We don't at the moment have an analog for English law, the law of Spain, Hong Kong, you name it. And you know, of course, you know, I know that, you know, your primary concern is the US market, but I need to think about this across a huge number of jurisdictions. I have to come up with a formula that works for the US and England and everywhere else. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is an opportunity for people like you who are leading the work in this space to provide really good, strong, and technical examples that can be replicated elsewhere.
Right. Actually, we might have an announcement related to this jurisdiction question pretty soon as well, because it's definitely on our radar.
Yeah.
Actually, you're pretty uniquely positioned in operating across so many different jurisdictions. Are there new challenges that emerge? Does the same product operate differently in different jurisdictions?
You have to modify the way the product looks and feels for the jurisdiction in question. I mean, a really good example, which we've not yet fully solved to my satisfaction, is Vincent is a very US-centric product too, in kind of look and feel for English-speaking lawyers. Mm-hmm. It does lots of things that are super useful to an English barrister, for example, or an English solicitor in a law firm. But at the moment, on Vincent, if you look at the word analyze, it will have a Z instead of an S, and it's incredibly offensive to British eyes. So, yeah, it does. It's difficult to build a product that can flex to different geographies without the user being aware of it happening. And you know, it's a rod that we made for our own back, because we think it's important that our customers have the law of all of the jurisdictions that we cover all in one place, rather than having to buy one product for the US, one for the UK, one for Spain, one forever. It's all under one roof. But it creates, for evaluation, it creates distinct challenges because you can't use the same evaluation approach from one jurisdiction to the next necessarily.
So I understand that you were a lawyer at some point as well.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Before all this. Is there some part of your job, back in the day, for which you would have really liked to have Vincent AI by your side?
Look, so I don't want to answer this in a cheesy way.
Okay.
But honestly, legal research was... I became a lawyer because I kind of liked legal research. I was always a bit of a geek, and legal research was something I kind of found fun and satisfying to do. But going back 15 years, kind of when I was doing that thing, you really didn't have that many ways to do legal research. Like, you either picked up a book or 10 different books. You had to go all the way to a library to pick up some kind of specialist textbook. Or you needed to sort of sit in front of something like Westlaw or LexisNexis and kind of somehow unpack the problem you were trying to answer into a search box or a bunch of search boxes. And it was it's kind of arduous when you think back to doing that. And that's the way a lot of legal research is done even today. But this idea, and this isn't exclusive to Vincent, other vendors are doing this too, but this idea that I can actually have a legal research question, under what circumstances can I do X, Y, or Z? And I can just ask the question and receive an answer that is fluent, is grounded on the authority that I would have been trying to get my hands on in the library or on one of those kind of conventional legal research platforms. And it's just within a couple of minutes, I've got this answer with the authority all linked that I can click into and just have this amazing starting point. And the value of that's immense because you get that launch pad within seconds. But you can do it across any area of law that you can think of. And to kind of maybe get the plug-in for Vincent, I can do that for like 15 or 16 different jurisdictions. And so I sometimes think it's really difficult at this point here in 2025, where we're getting so used to these kind of almost like quarterly quantum leaps, that it really isn't that long ago, maybe 2.5 years, where the scenario I just described, being able to ask a question in natural language and get a good answer back, was completely impossible. And I think it's good just to reflect on that a bit sometimes. We've come a very long way in a really short space of time.
Right, and we'll likely see even further development from this as well, continue to change how legal research happens.
Absolutely, because all we can do now is go deeper.
Right.
With all of this, whether it's evaluation, whether it's the development of new functionality and workflows. I heard, I was having a conversation with someone who kind of works at a pretty important organisation in this area, like a big producer of models that we use. And their analogy was that we're like the first few meters into a marathon. We've only just started this journey, so there's a long way to go, and I think we just need to give ourselves the time to get good at all of this, get better, and learn together as much as a community as we can.
Beautiful. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Dan.
Pleasure.
And we'll welcome the audience in reviewing the VLAIR report when it comes out.